Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hi there, and welcome to episode 78 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, if you haven't already, please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, follow, whatever you need to do on your listening app. It really helps out the podcast and it boosts it in the lists of true crime for others to find and listen. If you have already, thank you so very much. You guys have no idea what it means to me for all of your support, truly. Also, if you can, I hope that you will share the TheKillFile podcast to your friends, family, or anyone who may like true crime. Podcasts really do make the more mundane things in life more fun. And I feel like until you are a listener, you don't really know how nice it is to have something like this to listen to while you drive, while you cook, while you clean, fold laundry, while you unwind with a glass of wine, while you're waiting in an office, or even while you're out shopping. But remember, if you do that, try to keep an eye out to protect yourselves because people are nuts. If you haven't yet, I hope that you guys will check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can read a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. And you can find the merch site if you want to check out what we have. We have some awesome stuff on there, so have a look and see if you like something. Don't forget to follow us and share a post here and there if you can. On social media, we are on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. It helps remind you to listen, and I'm still working on getting more pics up each week. I have a ton of work to do each week, but as I find my groove with the bonus content now added on, I will make time. Lastly, if you are enjoying The Kill File and you want some bonus episodes from myself, I would say join the Patreon. I will hopefully also be adding to the subscription service on Spotify as well. For those of you who are a little less technology savvy, I get it. When I say subscription service, it sounds super fancy, but really it's just a $5 a month fee for 2 extra episodes that are true crime adjacent, like natural disasters, plane crashes, gangsters, whatever I can find that's interesting. I really just want to get some help with the podcast so I can make even more content every week, but to do this, I'm going to need some help since I'm not famous and I'm not rich. Fingers crossed that one day I can pay for someone to help me a little each week. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about a good old-fashioned serial killer whose name was really familiar to the point where I had to make sure that I actually haven't covered him before, but I hadn't. I guess I'm finally to the point where things are blurring together. That, or being almost 40, is finally mushing my brain. Anyways, today we are going to be talking about a man named Robert Lee Yates Jr. Ever heard of him? He has also been called the grocery bag killer and the Spokane Serial Killer. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, talks of sexual assault on a minor, and murder of a minor. Let's jump in. Today's story is going to take us up to the Pacific Northwest, where it is known that plenty of serial killers have come from. Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, Kenneth Bianchi, and Harvey Kerrigan have all come from the same area. There are theories as to why so many serial killers had come from here, one of which is heavy metals that were in the industrial pollution in the air, helping the development of serial killers. I believe that this is talked about in a book by Caroline Fraser called Murderland. I've heard great things about this book, and I definitely want to read it. I find the theory super interesting. In the book, I guess she talks about air pollution, like lead and arsenic, coming from something called a Sarco smelter that I guess is located in Tacoma. And her theory is about how these toxins and metals in the air may have caused neurological damage and could actually have contributed directly to psychopathy and tendencies of violence. If you guys have read this, you gotta tell me what your thoughts are about it. So I had to look into what a Sarco was because I have never heard of this, and according to an AI overview, it is the American Smelting and Refining Company that was formed in 1899 as a way to consolidate smelting companies that focused on lead and silver, and then it became a major producer of copper. There seem to be quite a few plants all over the country, though, but it has since been shut down completely, if I understand correctly, due to its emissions and what it has done to the environment and people. In 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed, and in the U.S., in 1972, dangerously high levels of lead were discovered in children living in El Paso, Texas, below the smoker stacks. I would also be curious to see some sort of report on how many killers or serial killers had come from these areas where the various metals and toxins that are linked scientifically to more violent behaviors have come from. I mean, it can't account for everything or everyone, but I still find this stuff interesting. I may have to add it to a Hidden Files episode. We shall see. All right, so let's talk a little bit about where our serial killer of the day came from: Spokane, Washington. Some of these murders will take place in the late 70s and 80s, but it seems that the bulk of the murders took place in the late 90s. So let's build our background picture around that time frame in the area. Spokane, Washington in the 90s was going through a little bit of an economic hardship because natural resources and manufacturing was experiencing a recession, and sadly this would impact wages for various families. A huge industrial employer in the area called Kaiser Aluminum had to make layoffs as well as labor strikes that went on during the later part of the 90s. One thing that would help this area was the rise in technology, where some different companies were coming in to help the dependency on the more traditional industries. Although we know that technology can be a little bit more difficult to learn and adapt to for some people, I can imagine that this time it would be actually a little bit rougher. The downtown Spokane area was able to be preserved better than most U.S. downtown areas, but a few major stores like JCPenney and others had to close their doors. Also, there was a huge controversy about an area called River Park Square being turned into a huge shopping mall, trying to bring in more commerce to the area's economy. One area in particular that will come up in the story is a place called East Sprague, specifically a place called The Track. This is an area that is known for sex workers and drugs, unfortunately. The residents of the area, as well as the police, were discussing some efforts that could be or would be made to try and help clean up this area. This will come into our story later down the line. Now, let's go back to our serial killer's childhood and learn a little bit about him. Robert Lee Yates Jr. was born on May 27, 1952, into what was said to be a middle-class family that was known to have religious beliefs. They were said to be a part of the Seventh-day Adventists religious group, and the entire family was known to attend church on a regular basis. Although Yates was born in Spokane, he was mostly raised in an area called Oak Harbor, which is on Whidbey Island. The Yates family was said to be what most would consider a quote-unquote normal all-American family. Robert Yates Sr. was said to be employed at the local naval yard or naval base, and his father was also the coach for Little League. So a lot of the time when we search out backgrounds on these serial killers, we try to pinpoint what went wrong or what happened to them that makes them the way that they are. Not that it's ever an excuse for their behavior, because it's absolutely not, but at least for me, this part is so interesting and fascinating, and I want to know what makes people the way that they are, what makes them tick. So in this particular case, when it came to Yates, there wasn't known to be anything within the family that could point to a serial killer coming from this home. After watching an episode on World's Most Evil Killers, where a woman that I have spoken of many times before, Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, who I personally love and want her job, anyways, she spoke to the fact that one thing in Yates' life that would usually be seen as something shameful back then or something of note was the fact that Yates was allegedly sexually abused by an older neighborhood boy when Yates was just 6 years old. On that same episode, a forensic psychologist named Rex Julian Bieber said that usually in a kid's life, if there is even just one positive role model around the kid, then that is usually enough to keep them from growing up later becoming psychologically disturbed. But that doesn't seem to be the case with Yates. This is the time-old question: are they born this way? Another thing that people often point to when it comes to Yates being a serial killer is a little family history. Apparently, Yates' grandmother, a woman named Novella Johnson Yates, would end up killing her husband one evening. Novella, according to Chattanooga Daily Times, was arrested following what was charged as felonious assault after attacking her husband, and her bond was set at $3,000. According to an article that came out on October 20th of 1945, she was released from Warren County Jail on her bond. Sheriff Eldridge Youngblood, great name, said in a conference that Novella took an axe as her husband slept and hit him in the head, penetrating his brain with the blade, and also had inflicted more minor head wounds as well. After the incident, it was reported that Novella would end up being admitted to what they called back then a mental institution. But I couldn't find any information on whether she was actually prosecuted for the murder or not. There was talk that it could be possible that maybe in the Yates family, women could have been looked at as dangerous or something to the like, but I think that's a far stretch in trying to figure out why Yates turned out the way he did, and I can imagine that this wasn't a subject that was often brought up in a religious family like they were. Growing up, Yates was said to be a big fan of peanut butter and jelly, and he was also known to have sang in the choir. I guess he also didn't eat any type of pork, one source said. At home, he had a dog named Lassie, and another thing that was often talked about was how Yates was a baseball player in school. A pitcher, in fact. He was an average student, nothing to brag about, but he was intelligent, and the same when it came to his sport. As Yates finished high school, he would head off to Walla Walla College, which one source said was a religious school, and this is where he would meet his first wife, Shirley Nylander. During the time of his first marriage, it was said that Yates was kind of a loner. Like, he wanted to be off on his own in the woods where he would fish, hike, and hunt. This seemed to be so much so that his first mother and father-in-law would say that they never really felt like they got to know Yates very well. He didn't seem to come around all that often because he was out doing that stuff on his own, which is kind of weird. This first marriage would only last 18 months, and after this, Yates would drop out of college. This would be the same year that Yates would get a divorce from Shirley, and he would meet his next wife, Linda Brewer. Later on that year, the married couple had their first child, a daughter. They would actually end up having 4 daughters and a son. I believe it was the first year after his daughter was born, if sources are correct, where Yates would commit his first pair of murders. On July 13, 1975, while Yates was out on his hiking and hunting adventures, he would come across a pair of people that some people say were a couple, some would say good friends, but either way, he encountered 21-year-old Patrick Oliver and 22-year-old Susan Savage while they were picnicking near Walla Walla. For whatever reason, when Yates came upon the pair, he would commit his first known murders. Yates would shoot Patrick in the head 3 times before turning the gun onto Susan and shooting her twice. After Yates killed the two, he then took off most of Susan's clothing and had placed her on top of Patrick and left the pair in this manner until they were discovered a few days later. However, their murders would go unsolved for a very long time. It was around the time of the first murders when Yates would get a job as a prison guard in Walla Walla. Dr. Yardley believes that he may have been drawn to this particular field of work because he would be in power and have control over others, which could be in his fantasies and a part of why he enjoyed killing people. It's believed that before Yates ever committed his first murder that he may have actually been fantasizing about killing someone for quite some time, which could be why he seized the opportunity when he came upon the pair picnicking. Yates would only end up working as a prison guard for about 4 months, and after this, he would work as a janitor in a hospital. In October of 1976, Yates' mother would pass away from a long battle with cancer, and the very next year is when Yates would enlist in the U.S. Army. A running theme of this case and why it had such a profound effect on so many people is because Yates was absolutely living a double life, not unlike BTK. He would end up in the military, and we will talk about all of that, but he would end up a decorated soldier, a father of 5 married to his wife, who he seemed to love, and absolutely no one who knew him would have ever thought that he was capable of such heinous acts. These kinds of serial killers scare the shit out of me. Give me the freaky, dead-eyed people who are weird and odd over someone who seems like the normal average Joe, but really ends up with feeling pleasure or joy from killing someone. A few years after Yates had joined the Army, he would enroll in courses to become a helicopter pilot, and I want to say this also includes maybe officer training as well. Yates would end up being a helicopter pilot in the 503rd Aviation Unit and would end up being stationed in many places, some of which were Somalia and Germany. Something that was noted in much of my resource was that while Yates was stationed in Somalia, he was out on a helicopter ride once, and he was said to have shot a pig from inside the bird for no apparent reason, but he was able to hit it while he was moving, which would put him at not being a bad marksman. It would later be known that murders started to follow wherever Yates was at, but I was very curious and could not find anywhere if there are possibly murders while he was in other countries. The authorities believe that there are definitely other murders that are unknown from Yates, which makes sense. I mean, the first pair were in 1975, and then he allegedly didn't kill again until 1988. And then still not again until 1996, when he would go on like a 2-year-long rampage. I know that some serial killers do have periods of downtimes and breaks, but if there are thoughts to be other victims from Yates, I wonder if they have ever checked areas where he was stationed in other countries. So around October of 1984, Yates would end up being a support aviator in Fort Rucker, Alabama, for a few different units, and this is when he would actually teach other soldiers how to fly something called Huey helicopters. The murder that would take place between this time and the time that Yates would abruptly get out of the military, and we'll talk about that in a second, is a murder in December of 1988. A young woman named Stacy E. Hahn, aged just 23 years old, was murdered in Washington, where at first her murder was thought to have been contributed to the Green River Killer. She is said to be the first sex worker that Yates would go on to kill, which would end up being his victim profile. After Stacy's skeletal remains were found, the cause of death would be seen as a single gunshot wound to the head, which would also be Yates's MO. After joining the military in 1977, Yates was just 18 months away from getting his full military pension, meaning that he was active for about 18 and a half years, and then abruptly out of nowhere, he yanked his family out of Alabama and he took them back to Spokane, Washington. Not only was Yates so close to retirement from the military, but he was also, as mentioned previously, a decorated officer, receiving 3 Meritorious Service Medals, 3 Army Commendation Medals, 3 Army Achievement Medals, 2 Armed Forces Expeditionary Medals, and a U.S. Army Master Aviator Badge. Now, what would cause someone who has dedicated most of their life to the military, seemingly working towards this goal of being a lifer where you would serve your full 20 years and then get a good pension and medical benefits for life, to just up and leave with only like a year and a half left? It is speculated that the only thing that could cause someone to flee like that is a murder. A murder that occurred in the area he was stationed at before he pulled his family back to Washington was in Dale County, Alabama. There had been a murder of a 19-year-old trans woman sex worker that sadly had been shot in the face, not far from where the base was that Yates was stationed at. It's speculated and widely believed that it was Yates that had committed this crime, and that's why he quit the military 18 months shy of his pension and fled, because he didn't want to get caught. Now, some have said maybe he did this because he didn't know the woman was trans, but personally, it doesn't strike me as the only reason, because he ends up targeting sex workers and shooting them as he progresses, so he could have just killed her to kill her. Who knows? Okay, so after he heads back to Spokane, Washington, and Dr. Yardley points out that without the restrictions or regiment of the military, things could get worse. In 1997, so after he starts the killing spree that we will talk about in a minute, he ends up in the National Guard, wanting again to be a helicopter pilot. For whatever reason, there's a period of time that Yates is grounded and he's not allowed to fly. 6 months after moving back to Spokane, Washington, Yates would get a job at a plant called Pantrol, and then he would do his weekend visits for the National Guard across the state of Washington. All right, so let's go through the victims and what happened to them, where they were mostly all sex workers who were vulnerable, and I'm guessing Yates used this to his advantage during his double life. On May 27, 1996, Yates would encounter a sex worker by the name of Shannon Zielinski, who was 38 years old, when she was last seen around 1 p.m. that day near the streets of Sprague and Helena in Spokane. She had apparently been out with friends, drinking some alcohol with a group of guys, where at some point she had an encounter with police, but she was not arrested. Yates would shoot her in the head, wrapped a towel around her head after she was deceased, where she would be found July 14th in Meade. Some of the victims would be found in the nude, but Shannon was in gray shorts, pantyhose, white socks, and one higher black boot. The other was found nearby her remains. They would fingerprint Shannon to figure out her identity, but with her remains, there wasn't much blood and no sign of a struggle. Authorities believed that she was killed elsewhere and dumped, as the Spokane serial killer often did. The next victim was said to be a 60-year-old woman named Patricia Barnes, who was found to be shot twice, covered with some brush after she was dead, and found 3 days after her death on August 25, 1996. She was said to be last seen near the Seattle area with curlers in her hair, and after further investigation was not known to have been linked to any drug use or sex work. She was known to drink, which they did find alcohol in her system during her autopsy. They also found a bag not far from her remains, which had curlers from her hair. The ballistics would show a .22 caliber handgun had been used, and when she was discovered, she was nude. 1 year after the remains of Shannon Zielinski was found, the authorities would find 2 more bodies. 20-year-old Heather Hernandez, who was also a sex worker and sadly had been found to be decomposing wearing only a shirt and bra. It was clear to Detective Hill, who was on the case of this serial killer, that there was a trail of blood that would suggest that Heather had been dragged to the location. The next victim was just 16 years old, and she was named Jennifer Joseph. Her remains were found on August 26, 1997, and her body was said to be in an advanced state of decomposition. Later, there was said to be semen found on the body that would match the DNA of Yates. When Jennifer was found, at her crime scene there would be found a blue towel along with her blouse that was missing a fake mother-of-pearl button, and some black leather pants, underwear, 2 shoes, and a used condom. And also a radio antenna, which is fucking weird. This button would later be found in the infamous Corvette that was possibly linked to the Spokane serial killer, although Yates had already sold it. More on this later. Next found on November 5th, 1997, would be the body of a 29-year-old woman named Darla Sue Scott, found unfortunately decomposing by a man that had been out walking his dog. The body would be found, and 2 plastic bags were with her remains, and her cause of death would be figured out to be 2 gunshot wounds to her head. Later, DNA matching Yates would be found in the form of semen with the body. Medical examiners would be able to tell the gunshot wounds were from a small caliber handgun. It was later figured out that Yates would most likely go hunting for a victim in the way of sex work. He would usually take them to some remote place, have sex with them, also sometimes do drugs with them as well, and then out of nowhere, shoot and kill his victims. He would then often dispose of the body or dump it somewhere other than where they had been killed. Yates was known to have wrapped the women's head in plastic bags after they were deceased to keep the blood from making a mess inside of his car, and then he would leave the remains. Sometimes he would bury them in a shallow grave, others that he would leave on the side of the road. It would be later found that the authorities were picking up a pattern from their serial killer that many of the women were found to have histories of drug addiction or having engaged in sex work, and all of them were said to have been shot in the head with a smaller caliber gun. Several of the victims' gunshot fragments would be compared, and ballistics would find that they were mostly from a .25 caliber handgun, believed to be probably a semi-automatic pistol. A witness would eventually come forward with the information that one of the victims was last seen getting into a white Corvette. This would be the tip that would lead the authorities to be on the lookout for this exact car. The next victim, a 24-year-old woman named Melinda Mercer, was found with 3 gunshot wounds to her head and 4 plastic bags over the head wounds, and she was found on December 7th, 1997. When her body was discovered, it was found that Melinda's large green purse that she always carried with her was missing, along with some jewelry, which would lead the authorities to believe that these items were kept as trophies. Just 11 days, on December 18th, Shawn L. Johnson, a 36-year-old woman, would sadly be found with 2 gunshot wounds in her head, and later DNA from semen would be confirmed to be Yates. Her body would be found fully clothed, but it was sadly figured out that she had been thrown over the side of a steep embankment where her body had rolled down a hill until it came to a stop, and later there would be found some fibers that would be taken from her body for examination. Just a few days later, another victim of the Spokane serial killer would be found when Laura Wasson was found the day after Christmas. Now, Laurel would be found near, a gravel pit with 3 plastic bags over her head, and this time, they got a fingerprint on one of the bags. Yes, they got a print. On top of the body would be found concrete pieces, peanut shells, like packing peanuts, styrofoam, and other items that matched items and debris that would later be found in Yates's backyard. The next victim, Shawn, who was 39 years old, was found next to Laura Wasson, and just like Laurel, she had 3 plastic bags over her head with 2 gunshots to the head. Semen DNA would later link Yates to the murder. By the end of 1997, Yates had now had a dozen women who had been murdered, and not a single person was in custody for the crimes. On February 8, 1998, a 41-year-old woman named Sunny Oster was unfortunately found deceased in a wooded area that was said to be near the western portion of Spokane County. Again, 3 plastic bags around her head and semen found. Sunny was last seen working on East Sprague, and she had been seen carrying a larger beige purse that police later believed could have been taken as a trophy. Boy, Yates, not unlike many, truly fucked themselves when it came to DNA. The wonderful advancement of technology has helped solve so many murders. During the investigations into these murders that were seemingly all linked, yet DNA had not matched them yet, the FBI would be called in to help with a task force that was put together to catch this monster. The FBI agent who worked on the case was a man named Norm Browse. The special task force would work well over 100 man-hours tracking down leads and tips as they came in. One big question they were still trying to figure out was why the killer would choose the spots he did to dump the bodies. As the families and loved ones of the victims would start to hold memorials as the women were being found, undercover agents were attending these gatherings, just desperately trying to find anything or anyone involved, but to no avail. It has been stated that it was a common misconception in the case, as we have seen many times before, that maybe law enforcement wasn't taking these crimes as serious as they would in other murders because of the victim profiles. Women that were sex workers or used drugs were thought of as less than. However, detectives that worked on the case would say that this was untrue. They knew that these were human beings, and they say that they treated the cases as such. Although these may have been women of the night, it had a profound impact on the community. At the same time, there were still women who needed sex work to make money. And Dr. Yardley says the fact that they knew that there was a serial killer targeting sex workers, they still needed the money, and this would show their absolute desperation in whatever their cases may have been. So, as previously mentioned, a witness had seen one of the victims getting into a white Corvette, which had been on the police's radar. At some point after the tip of the vehicle was given and police were on the lookout, Yates was actually pulled over in his white Corvette. Unfortunately, a mistake would be made that wouldn't lead the authorities in his direction, as the officer who had pulled him over and had written notes about the incident misidentified the car, thinking that it was a Camaro, and that's what he had written down. It would end up biting them in the ass later on as they were narrowing suspects, and the mistakes wouldn't be figured out for a while. Yates would then sell his white Corvette and instead would buy a black van. The last 4 victims, like Sonny, would all be in 1998. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley would state that not only did she think that Yates has a narcissistic personality, but he is also one of the hardest kinds of serial killers to find because he was always hiding in plain sight. On April 1st, 1998, the body of a 34-year-old woman named Linda Mabin was found not far from where Laurel and Sean had been a few months prior. Linda's body had also been seen to be covered with vegetation that didn't grow in the area. It was placed there, and because it was so similar to the vegetation that they found growing near the other victims' remains, it held up the theory that the serial killer was bringing things from his own home to cover the victims with. Linda was found fully clothed with pieces of plastic bag left behind on her head, but the remains were decomposed, and to top it off, wildlife had messed with the remains. People who worked with or knew Linda said that at the time she was a user of crack and had always kept a pipe on her, like tucked into her pants where it wouldn't easily be found. However, that, along with a small drawstring bag used to carry Crown Royal that was also always with her, were both missing. Now, the next victim was a 43-year-old woman named Melody Ann Murfin, who went missing in May of 1998, and her murder has been linked to Yates. However, they were unable to find her body. This is when Yates would start to slip up and make some mistakes. Some might have said that he was getting sloppy or cared less, and others could argue that he was just arrogant and didn't think that he would ever be caught. But either way, he made mistakes. A 47-year-old woman named Michelin Durning would be found on July 7, 1998, under the cover of a hot tub by a homeless person. The area that she was found was widely known to be used for sex workers to find Johns. Her cause of death would also be a gunshot wound to her head. However, unlike other victims, Yates and Michelin did not have sex, or he didn't rape her. I'm not exactly sure if anyone knows if the sex was consensual or not in almost any of the cases. She was also the only victim that had not been taken to the outskirts of the city to be dumped. Instead, Yates buried her just a block away from where he worked at the plant. Because of this, the employees were obviously interviewed and questioned. Dr. Yardley would comment that her belief is that Yates probably found pleasure or joy in the fact that he was being interviewed about the murders, but feeling like no one was the wiser. The last victim of Yates, though there are possibly more, was attacked but would be the only victim to make it out alive. Christine Smith was unfortunately said to be robbed and assaulted by Yates in his van on August 1st, 1998. She would state that Yates was unable to perform in a sexual manner, and then he proceeded to rob her of the $40 that he had just given her, and then he shot her. Thankfully for Christine, the bullet grazed her head, and she was able to get the fuck out of the van and run. Now, the entire time after the incident, Christine had actually thought she had been stabbed. She even went to the hospital and made a police report, thinking that it was a stabbing, but also having got a look at her attacker. She would describe to the authorities what happened, where she would say that they had agreed to a price for their quote-unquote date, meaning sex work, and this is when Yates had driven her to a location, and while they were driving, the man told Christine that he was a helicopter pilot in the National Guard. I guess Christine even asked if he was the quote-unquote psycho killer that the news had been talking about, and he told her, of course, he wasn't, that he was a father of 5 and that he would never do anything like that. When they pulled into the parking lot, they got into the back of the van where there was a mattress. After Yates had given her the $40 for oral sex, Christine performed this for about 5 to 7 minutes, then saying that he was never able to get erect when all of a sudden he hit her in the head with something and told her to give his money back. The blow to her head was so vicious that she actually almost lost consciousness, but scrambled to find a door handle to run. Horrifically, she realized there wasn't a handle in the back to actually get out, so she went towards the front, saying that she was going to get his money, and she was able to jump out of the passenger door and flee. Although Christine had gotten away, Yates was apparently unable to stop himself as he was hunting for another victim just the next month. Yates picked up another young woman named Jennifer, and not long after, the pair were pulled over in Yates's black van. This is around the time that the authorities may have been suspicious about Yates, but they didn't really have anything concrete yet. After Yates and Jennifer were pulled over, sources say that Yates gave the story that Jennifer's father was somebody that he worked with and that he had called him and asked him to find his daughter, pick her up, and bring her home for him. Jennifer would then agree that she knew Yates, although she obviously did not. The officer was then forced to let them go because he didn't have anything to hold them on. As far as he knew, he was just driving a young woman home at 1:25 a.m. After this, though, Yates would then immediately let Jennifer go. The belief is that the police that night ended up unknowingly saving Jennifer's life, as had the police not saw her with him, he most likely would have killed her as he had the rest. This is about the time the detectives and FBI working on the case were looking into things that were matching up and who was on their list of possible suspects, that they would finally figure out that Yates had actually owned a Corvette before the van, not a Camaro. How did they do this? While he was being questioned, Yates actually told them himself. Yeah, what a dumbass. He must have really thought that no one was ever going to catch him, right? I guess they had brought him in again for questioning, and as they were questioning him, they brought up the Camaro that he used to own, and this is when he would correct them and say, actually, it was a 1977 white Corvette. While they were questioning him about the various dates of the murders, there were many that he couldn't account for. The authorities noticed that while Yates was in the interrogation room, that they had told him his name had come up in connection to serial murders, that he was sweating profusely. They assured him that he was not a suspect yet, but that they just needed to ask him some questions, and that he had the right to leave whenever he wanted to, and he didn't have to talk to them, which Yates acknowledged and continued with answering questions. When the night that he had Jennifer in his van and the two were pulled over came into question, Yates told the exact same story to the authorities that he had told to the officer that night. The authorities were no dummies, and they knew that this version or similar versions of stories were often told when a John had picked up a sex worker. When he was confronted by the police that this was a common story, he stuck to his guns and he didn't change it. But when they asked him what the young girl's name was, he couldn't come up with it, which is funny because if you knew her father enough to allegedly go get the girl, then you would know her name. When the authorities asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample, he said he wanted to go home and speak with his wife first, which is stupid. Then he called back later and said he would not give them DNA. They basically knew they were dealing with their guy, but they didn't have enough evidence yet to arrest him on the spot, so instead they had to have let him go, but they did surveil him. After the interrogation, authorities contacted Jennifer, the young woman who he was allegedly giving a ride to for her father, and she would tell them the real story. She said when Yates picked her up, they agreed on a price of $20 for oral sex, but as police were pulling them over, she told him to tell the story to the police about her dad, but she was now being honest about the fact that that story was untrue. When the authorities figured out that Yates had once owned and driven a Corvette, but that he had sold it a while back, they would track down the exact vehicle from the new owner, and they were able to bring it in for evidential searches. This is when they would not only find the fake mother-of-pearl button from the other Jennifer's clothing underneath the seat, but they also noticed the carpet fibers in the vehicle matched carpet fibers found on at least one of the victims who had been murdered 2 years prior. They would also luckily find inside of the car bloodstains that after being tested would prove to belong to Jennifer Joseph as well. This is when a warrant would be put out for his arrest. On April 17, 2000, although they had the arrest warrant for Yates, they would surveil him for 24 hours to see what he would do. And the next morning, after he left work, the authorities would serve a search warrant on his home and arrest Yates. They would take his DNA to ensure that it was a match to many of the victims, which, of course, with the semen being found on numerous victims, it was a perfect match. They also did a thorough search of Yates' home and property for any evidence, any blood, or anything that could tie him to the murders as well. And here is where they would find the exact match to the vegetation that had grown over and near some of the remains of the victims that he had tried to cover them up with. Remember that for the most part, Yates was able to keep his personas separate. On the one hand, he was this honored military veteran helicopter pilot who was not only very decorated, but also served his country for a very long time. He was a father of 5, married to his wife of a long time, and seemed to be this completely normal family guy. But on the other hand, he was this depraved serial killer who took pleasure in hunting sex workers, doing drugs with them at times, taking them to a remote location, and killing them with what is guessed probably no warning. Then he would take his victims to a remote location and dump their bodies. As they were searching Yates's van that he now drove, they were able to find 3 bullet holes in the vehicle as well as blood from 2 different victims. It was said in one source that Linda, his wife, came forward to tell the authorities about an incident where he was gone most of the night after having dropped their daughter off at work. When he returned at 6:30 the next morning, he went out to clean his vehicle with a few cleaning supplies, and when Linda saw blood on the bed of the van, Yates told her that he had accidentally ran over a dog. He then said he placed it in the back of his van to try to take it to a vet. She then said he removed the cushion, destroyed it, and replaced it, which is fucking weird. I couldn't help but think that this was not the best way to kill his victims. Like, having them bleeding in your car is just a terrible idea. I know that he got away with it for a long time, but I think that's mostly because of the lack of technology, and the women that he was targeting were marginalized, because the fact that there was semen found in the victims was just a ticking time bomb that he did not know was going to go off one day. I know that he used plastic bags to wrap their heads in to keep the blood from getting all over, but obviously that was not enough to keep the mess out of his vehicles. So the day after Yates was arrested, the news hit the media like a tornado, of course, because this guy is the one that they've been looking for a very long time. While his picture is being plastered all over the place, the one living victim that survived, Christine, would actually catch him on the news and realized that this was the guy who had attacked her. She was able to call the authorities with her information. It was actually not until Christine was later in a car accident that she would be taken to the hospital, and inside of her skull, there would be found bullet fragments or shrapnel. The entire time, she still believed that she had been stabbed by her attacker. After they had found these items in her head, she realized that she had actually been shot, and just how lucky she was to be alive after a grazing shot to the head. They would use these fragments that were then removed from Christine's head, and ballistics would show that they were a match to other bullets and fragments found on other victims. After the authorities were able to find Yates's weapons, they could match the ballistics to the bullets for just another added layer of proof. Now, Yates wanted to apparently avoid trial, maybe because they had him dead to rights, maybe because he didn't want to face people when it came to what he did, or maybe because he didn't want to embarrass his family or put them through an ordeal of a trial. But for whichever reason, Yates would plead guilty to 13 counts of murder. There would be more counts after he had already been in prison, as they would find new victims, and the authorities believe that there are still victims out there that are unknown. I honestly believe that there has to be some victims in other countries. I mean, the man traveled, and they already knew that there were bodies following him wherever he was, so I wonder if one day they'll be able to prove more victims were in other places. I wonder if there's like an international type of CODIS where they can search multiple places, where they can search multiple countries. So after this, I was curious and I had to look it up. And if I understand it correctly, the FBI has over 90 countries involved in the database of CODIS. But I think that you have to request for the DNA to be ran through the other systems, maybe? It said something about not having a direct link to the US database, so I wonder what that means exactly, but good to know that they may be able to do this. Okay, so Yates pleads guilty to, at the time, the 13 murders, and then later it went to 15. But as part of the plea deal that he took in order to save his ass from the death penalty and to get life in prison instead, he had to tell them where one of the victims who was never found, Melody, was located. Which he did, and this part, I'm not kidding you, gave me the fucking willies. On a crudely drawn map, Yates would reveal the location of where he had buried this victim, and it turns out that she was buried in his own fucking backyard. Yeah, actually, it was under his bedroom window in the yard. What the fuck? Dr. Yardley believes that this was actually an act that would give him the pleasure to know that he could watch over his victim and keep control over her as well, as his sadistic tendencies were probably growing. Yeah, so his wife and himself slept next to here, where he had actually buried this victim, which is just so sick and twisted. Not to mention, he had 5 kids. The crazy thing is that the property was thoroughly searched, and that included looking for anything that could have been buried there, and she was missed. They had no idea where she was. During sentencing, the daughter of Melody, the victim that was buried in his yard, would make a statement in which she commented on the fact that he buried her mother in his own yard, where his family walked for 2.5 years, and how he stole her soul. Yates would make his own statement, where one source would say there was hissing and jeering in the room, as Yates attempted to say that he was remorseful and had turned to God and hoped that God would help them with their sorrow. What the fuck ever, you sick freak. Yates would be given a total of 408 years in prison as his sentence. Then, in 2002, he was charged with 2 additional murders, but because these were not a part of his plea deal, he would actually be handed the death sentence of lethal injection. Luckily for him, Washington would end up abolishing the death penalty, so again, he got life in prison, which he is currently serving in the same place that he had once been a prison guard at. And that, my friends, is the story of Robert Lee Yates, the Spokane Serial Killer, aka the Grocery Bag Killer, in all of his heinous, murderous glory. This story was so interesting to me, and the ones like this are for me because you never really get to see the other side of these psychopaths. Like, with some of the serial killers that we talk about, we really get to see the depraved side of them and get to know their thoughts and what they like or why they do these things. But with people like this, these two-faced killers, there is such an air of mystery to them. Like, how can you be a loving father of 5 and a husband and also be a sick serial killer? It makes no sense to my brain. Like, is he full of shit and he doesn't even know what love is or how to be a normal person, but he fakes it? Does he actually love his children and his wife, but he has dark impulses? If Dexter has taught us anything, I guess it's that a parent can still care for their child, and while it may not be the love that others experience with their children, they still want to help them and want what's best for them. But I'm dying to know in cases like this why they do what they do. Were there any wires crossed in their youth, or were they born like this? This is one of those cases where nothing in their childhood points to wanting to kill sex workers, unless it was the abuse by a neighborhood kid, which is obviously not great. Maybe we don't know the ins and outs of that, and maybe abuse affects everyone differently, and for him it was enough to make him snap. But maybe not. I have so many questions, and if given the opportunity to ever get to sit down in a prison with a serial killer and just pick their fucking brains, I totally would. I want to know everything. Is that weird? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about the Spokane serial killer as much as I did, and I hope for all of our sakes that you do not take rides from strangers, and you do not pick up a John who drives a black van with a bed in the back. Come on back next Monday where we will cover another case here on the Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.